What's up guys, it's me Jeremy. Riot uses a lot of different mechanics and techniques when it comes to designing their game, and it can be quite hard to appreciate the little nuances of everything when you're just playing, but it's all of these little mechanics and techniques that add up together to make the game what it is, so I always enjoy taking a look at individual mechanics and breaking them down. And today we're looking at the mechanic of percent maximum health damage. And helping me out with the video today, I have to give a huge shout out to ProGuides.com. They recently released a new service that allows you to ask questions to higher ranked players and get a reply within under a single minute. And they have a free trial that gets you full access, so you don't have to take it from me, you can decide for yourself if you like it or not. Anyways, let's get started. Now, percent max health damage is a mechanic that Riot likes to use quite a lot, and it's definitely for good reason. I for one think it's a pretty interesting way to design an ability, and it does create some interesting gameplay interactions. And the concept of percent max HP damage is a pretty cool one, since the way that it works out, at least on paper, causes it to be a source of damage that has both a ceiling and a floor. And what I mean by that is that this type of ability is a lot less at risk of dealing too much damage and killing people too quickly, and it's also a lot less at risk of dealing too little damage in situations when you're behind. And because of that, it generally creates well-balanced and fair gameplay scenarios that have some positives for both the player using it and the player facing it. Since it has kind of a damage floor, it allows the ability, and therefore the champion, to still have some kind of relevant damage even when you're super far behind. And on the flip side, it makes it so that even when you're super far ahead, you aren't just going to be randomly one-shotting people. And by giving the damage sort of like a cap on both ends, it contributes a lot to really healthy gameplay elements. What percent maximum health damage scaling does is that it allows you to give someone a source of damage that interacts in a similar way versus all types of opponents. Regardless of who you hit it with, you're going to be dealing roughly the same amount of damage in terms of the percent of their overall health. And this allows you to deal solid damage versus tanks without actually becoming ridiculous when you're attacking someone who's not a tank. So it allows you to have relevant damage, but in a way that's a lot more fair to play against for everyone. However, one thing I have to mention that is a very relevant argument to percent max HP damage actually not being that good of a mechanic is that it potentially can allow a champion to deal a lot of relevant damage without actually having to build any damage items. And as a result, you get this super tanky raid boss who still deals an insane amount of damage to people, which is certainly at risk of being overpowered. It's much better to make a champion have to make the choice between being a bit more squishy and dealing more damage, or choosing to be a bit more tanky and dealing less damage. And itemization is usually what will allow a champion to make that choice, and it's pretty reasonable to expect that kind of trade-off, since getting killed in 3 seconds by someone that takes you 20 or 30 seconds to kill is kind of ridiculous, and percent max HP damage can potentially contribute to that type of scenario, and it does hurt the idea of that trade-off of choosing the tankiness versus choosing the damage. So there are definitely a lot of situations where you wouldn't want to put it on a champion. And as a result, when implementing this mechanic of percent max HP damage, it's important to consider that type of raid boss situation and definitely try to avoid it. A lot of times this is done by doing a non-scaling kind of low base damage value, but then having a solid amount of scaling on the damage ratio. Another way you could potentially do this is to just heavily gate the ability behind some kind of interaction, to where it still does a lot of damage, but it's never going to kill someone really quickly, because you do have to do some kind of interaction or meet some sort of condition before actually getting it, which makes it a lot more fair, and it also makes it a lot more possible to outplay, and that's probably the more common way that it's been implemented in League of Legends, since Riot really likes the idea of tanks having some relevant damage, but gated behind some kind of interaction, which is why we see this mechanic on so many 3-hit passive, because it allows the melee top laners and tanks to be a lot more fun to play and create more interesting gameplay patterns in melee versus melee combat. Riot Gypsy Lord commented a bit about this mechanic and the design concepts behind it, and he said that essentially, percent max HP damage is something that is really great to put on certain types of champions. And he argued that percent max HP damage is a mechanic that potentially does have a place on almost every tank in the game as kind of like a baseline thing, a baseline mechanic for those tanks to have, since it gives them a lot of threat and relevancy in a fight that makes their kits a lot more interesting, a lot more fun to play, but is still very healthy and easy to balance, and especially fair to play against. And he went on to say how 3-hit passives were a great way to implement that percent max HP damage, and as long as the percent max HP damage isn't something that's too powerful with too little of an interaction, meaning that there's some kind of a delay, or you require some condition to be met, or maybe you have a low base value but high scaling with damage stats, then it's something that can be pretty awesome. And let's take a look at a couple of examples on opposite ends of the spectrum that showcase a lot of the characteristics of this mechanic. Let's start with someone like LeBlanc, who does not have any percent max HP damage in her kit whatsoever. LeBlanc actually does a very reasonable amount of damage to tanks, but it's a lot more because she just does insane damage to a squishy target, with really solid potential to just one-shot them instantly. And being one-shot instantly isn't exactly fun nor fair to play against, although it's necessary for LeBlanc to have that kind of gameplay as an assassin. And as a result, LeBlanc becomes much more volatile. When she's ahead, she's unstoppable, and when she's behind, she's almost useless and has a really hard time catching up. This isn't the best example since percent max HP damage can't really be used as a form of burst damage at all, and so it doesn't really make sense to put that mechanic on assassins. But LeBlanc does show a lot of the problems with alternate damage types that percent max HP damage doesn't entirely have. LeBlanc is an extremely volatile champion, and is very one-dimensional in terms of her gameplay patterns since it revolves pretty much entirely around whether or not she can successfully kill her target. And she also becomes very unhealthy when she becomes too far ahead, since it reaches the point where it's just so easy for her to kill anyone, and it happens way too fast to be able to react or outplay most of the time. And percent max HP damage does eliminate a lot of those problems, at least it does on paper, however it can't really be done with burst damage. But let's take Malzahar, who's a great example of this mechanic being implemented since he's fairly recent and he gains some percent max HP damage on his ultimate. Before, Malzahar was quite unhealthy because his ultimate resulted in burst damage oriented gameplay patterns, which are again, as we saw in the LeBlanc example, typically volatile and one-dimensional, and so it was replaced with percent max HP damage, which resulted in an ultimate that was much better designed, and it was also a lot better when he's behind. And although Malzahar was overpowered after the change, it was kind of for different reasons that just happened to happen on the same patch. And the percent maximum HP damage being put on his ultimate was a pretty good decision, and it made the ability a lot more healthy and fair to play against, especially when he's ahead. Those examples do an okay job of showing off the design concepts of the mechanic, but when it comes to actually implementing it, it's much better to just put it on a tank or a bruiser. And the reason why is because percent max HP damage is a form of sustained damage. You aren't going to be one-shotting people with it, and there's usually better mechanics or forms of utility to give a sustained DPS mage or an AD carry most of the time, Malzahar being kind of a good exception. So the most practical way to use percent max HP damage is really just to give a tank relevant sustained damage without having it be overpowered, at least depending on how you implement it. There's certainly a lot of exceptions, but that's definitely the most common and most likely place that we've seen the mechanic in the game. So what do you think about percent max HP damage? Hope you guys enjoyed this look into the insights of the champion designers and the choices they make surrounding this mechanic, and it looks like that's going to be it for me today. If you enjoyed the video, hit that like button, subscribe if you want. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.